Sunday, March 16, 2025. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minutenews. Our guest today is a political analyst and author of several books, including American Rule, How a Nation Conquered the World but Failed Its People, and Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. Jared Yates Sexton, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Anthony, my friend, I always appreciate these talks. I just wish that we had better things to talk about. I wish that you and I could have a little bit of a jaunt, a little bit of a jolly.
Right. And I always caveat, because I tend to giggle a bit, and it's a nervous laughter. You know, I don't find any of this stuff humorous, but I kind of don't really know what to do when we're talking about kind of existential threats in this way. Your book, which you have behind you, describes the coming crisis. Would you say that your predictions, both in that book and in your other writings, have come to fruition? Are we experiencing what you warned us of?
Unfortunately. This was one of those situations where, you know, I started researching both American Rule and the Midnight Kingdom years ago, and something became very obvious once I started following the facts where they were, and I started looking throughout history. And it became apparently clear that it was not going to resolve itself, that there was going to have to be some sort of a major response towards MAGA, towards the international authoritarian right-wing movement that we're dealing with, the oligarchical coup that we're now dealing with. And it became obvious that if there was not that aggressive response, if we did not fix the material conditions that led us to this moment, that we would eventually find ourselves where we are now. And it's a sobering feeling to have seen it coming for a while. And you know what's funny about it? I would have all these interviews, and in the midst of an interview, the interviewer would always say, well, this is really depressing. And I would say, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk about these things. I would much rather avoid what has happened. But it's been a surreal experience watching the crisis that I saw formulating and more or less coming over the horizon. And now we're smack dab in the middle of it. And I want to make sure, because I think it's important to differentiate on this, that doesn't mean that we've lost all hope. That doesn't mean that there isn't a possibility for a better future or some sort of an alternative. And at the same time, I also have to tender that with a sober reminder, which is crises have a tendency to get worse. And what we're dealing with right now is almost sort of the precursor. It's almost the foreshock of what could potentially come down the path if we still don't deal with these conditions and still don't deal with the problem that we're facing right now. But yes, we are currently smack dab in the middle of the crisis that I was fearing.
So with this crisis in mind, Jared, do you feel, as I do, that there seems to be a collective denial from the media and from commentators that America has fallen into an authoritarian regime? That you know, this loss of democracy has already happened, that the constitutional crisis is already upon us? Because we talked for years, especially during Trump's first term, of this possibly happening. But I do still struggle to even hear people admitting that that's where we're at.
Absolutely. And I think the longer that this has gone on, I first started getting involved in researching this and warning about this back in 2015, 2016. And, you know, back then, Anthony, I always had a feeling that if I just said the right thing, if I just explained it the right way, right, that people would understand what was happening. And of course, back then, and I'm sure this happened with you as well, we were called hysterical. We had Trump derangement syndrome. We looked at this guy and we projected onto him all of our fears and insecurities. And back in the first Trump administration, there were going to be adults in the room. Right. He was eventually going to moderate. He was eventually going to pivot. And now we've reached this moment where for years, people were in denial about the possibility that he could win another term. And even if he did win another term, I'm sure that he wouldn't carry out this Project 2025 idea that had been orchestrated by the wealth class and their institutes and think tanks.
Because he didn't know what it was.
Right. And
he never read it, despite saying there was a few good things.
He had no idea. Right. And meanwhile, those of us, and this is the problem, is those of us who have paid attention to this, it's not some sort of psychic divination, right? We've listened to what these people have said. We've read their books. We've read their articles. We take them at their word because we've seen what they do. And we've all along been in this weird poisonous stasis in which the people who should know about these things either deny them and don't pay attention to them. I think it's wild that people are now suddenly discovering who Curtis Yarvin is, even though he's been one of the soothsayers for the tech oligarchical class for years now. And we look at what's happening, and there's so much normalcy bias, I think, that takes place, both in the media and the political classes. We heard it with Joe Biden. The Republicans are suddenly going to wake up from their nightmares. Their fever's going to break. We heard that when he first got in office. We keep hearing from people like Nancy Pelosi. We need a strong Republican Party on the other side. We need, our colleagues. What's happened to them? Our news media has no idea whatsoever how to actually cover what's happening because it feels so far outside of their sort of realm of vision. Because to actually talk about what has happened would mean looking in the mirror. It would mean taking note and stock of the privilege of their conditions in their world and the fact that they work for corporate news media and the fact that they've carried water for these people and legitimized them for years now. So one of the issues that's taken place here is that sense of it's almost like the cognitive dissonance of living in the beginning of a fascistic, authoritarian, oligarchical, illiberal society. It I think really frightens people. So there are some people who are in denial of it because it is so large and so scary. And also, if it were true, and this is a problem with the political class, the media class, and the citizen class, if it were true, it would mean they had to do something. It would mean that something would have to change, that they would have to put something on the line in the process of it. So one of the things I keep saying is, this isn't just a political crisis. It's not just an economic crisis. It's also a mental health crisis. We have so many people who are captured within these cycles. You look at Donald Trump, you look at Elon Musk, all the people who are around him, all of their cronies and all of their sycophants. These are not well people. Right? We see that every single day. But then there are a lot of other people who are caught in these enabling cycles where they don't want to see what's happening right before their very eyes. And as a result, it continues to fortify what's happening. So one of the biggest issues that we have right now is we do need a major political and cultural and economic sea change. But in order to have that change, the first step is to admit that there's a problem. And so far, many, many people have failed in that step.
So many countries, not just the US, are unable to communicate how mental health crosses over into politics or even into, employment, business. And there are millions of people who are suffering from depression or bipolar, who can't tell their bosses, who can't admit to it, who play it down, who struggle. And then, of course, there's the narcissism, the malignant narcissism, the personality disorders. The difference with Trump and this group, though, is that they don't have the self-awareness or even the diagnosis to acknowledge that there's something wrong. And therefore, the other side doesn't want to call it because it's as if you're accusing somebody of something that is outside of the realms of being socially acceptable to kind of diagnose somebody who you don't really know. And so there is a kind of lack of conversation about this mental health crisis that is not just from our leaders, but as you describe, is also of the voters as well. And that really, I suppose that there are two words that have kind of crossed the Rubicon. Weird, which started, with the Democrats, and this kind of, a narcissism. These two words are starting to cut through. And I think that people recognize the narcissist because some have either been in relationships with narcissists or have them in their own families, and they can see this kind of total tunnel vision. But what it's done is it has turned the whole world upside down. So it kind of started as just something to talk about, but now we're seeing the effects of this mental health crisis, both in leadership and in the cult of Trump, those who continue to support him. I personally don't see a route out of this because there is still no kind of social remedy for discussing mental health.
Yeah, and I want to touch on a couple of things because this is such a large topic, but it's essential to understanding what's happening in our politics and culture right now. First things first, if you actually look at authoritarian movements, dictatorial societies, what you recognize is that they are manic, self-destructive movements. They're full of these grandiose ideas that they should take over the world, that they should have everything, that the people that they hate should suffer and hurt. And in fact, they get gleeful, joy out of seeing the people that they dislike hurt. So one of the things, and by the way, it's always sort of aided, and we don't have to get totally into this, but these people are always on stimulants and uppers. Like this has become one of the cultural sort of notations of this.
Well, they're running from themselves.
No,
so
absolutely.
They have to keep going.
They're miserable. And if you actually take a look at Donald Trump and Elon Musk, which, man, what a tragedy it is that these two people have met and gotten in each other's orbits.
And fallen in love.
Right. These are two people who are not just unwell, but both of them are driven by the type of trauma that they went through with their parents and their families.
Yeah.
Like Elon Musk wants to have all of these children and all this power and get to Mars because he wants to prove something to the father who never loved him. The exact same thing with Donald Trump in terms of his real estate and also his political power. They are vacuous black holes that suck in everything and then destroy them. Meanwhile, what ends up happening is there's a larger framework to this, which is those types of people who are searching for that type of gratification, that type of a cure for what it is that ails them. They create cults of power and worship around them. And so when you actually take a look at the mental health of the United States of America and every other country right now that is underneath neoliberal globalism uses austerity and precarity to control people. You are supposed to be afraid to leave your job. You're supposed to be afraid that you could lose your employment at any given moment. You're supposed to feel like you are one step away from possibly losing your house, your home, everything that you've worked for. That's what keeps you working. That's what keeps you accepting contracts that don't pay you what you deserve. That's what keeps you in a workplace that is exploitative of you, which is the larger sort of motivation behind this. But while that's happening, your own mental health is suffering. We live in like this capitalist society where we're just told the main thing to do is to consume and keep going. People are looking for meaning. And while things are happening and there are no explanations, they're looking for someone to give them explanations. So what happens is those cult figures that we're discussing, they give them a worldview. And the main trick of MAGA, and I've seen this with my family, I've seen this with my communities that I'm from, I've seen it from one person after another in so much dialogue that I've had, they're desperate for meaning. They want to feel like they don't live in a United States that's in decline. They want to feel like they live in a world in which they can have agency. And what Donald Trump asks of his people is he asks less of them. He tells them, you don't have to care about other people. You don't have to have empathy. You don't have to think about things. Just do what I'm doing and you're fine. Engage in what you're doing, which is an ultimate enabling act that we're talking about. And what you just said, I think, is correct, which is, how, is there a way out of this? And I want to be very clear about something. A large amount of the cultists within the MAGA world, you're not going to reach them. You can't just go to a cult member and say, hey, you're in a cult, you should leave the cult, right? Because that isolates them, it only pushes them further. And we are a profoundly lonely society. And in MAGA, as disgusting and as much of a lie as it is, it gives them community.
Yeah.
It gives them something to belong to and something to put order to. But there are people who have been caught up in the faux populistic part of MAGA who, and say what you want about Donald Trump. He has at times been honest about things. One of the nut of this thing, the core of it, is that MAGA says, listen, you have been screwed over in the United States of America. Well, guess what? That's true. And they gain followers and power and purchase by saying the quiet part that the Democratic Party hasn't been very interested in saying, that there's not a lot of voice of it, which is there is a screwing over that's taking place. But immediately what happens is they bring you in and then they change the trajectory of the blame from the people that they work with and the people that they serve to people of color, women, trans, gay people, immigrants, you name it. And so what happens is they get entrapped. But there are millions of people in this country that we have more in common with, and we do have interconnected fates with. And I think one of the things that we're seeing, and there's not a lot to be grateful for with this administration, But one thing to be grateful for, Anthony, is that they have been blatant. The richest man in the world is in control of the government, and he has no ability to moderate himself. He has to be in every frame. He has to be in every press gaggle. He has to take credit for it. He's disgusting. He's overt about it. That has allowed a cultural and class backlash to start to grow. And there are inroads that we can make if we change the way we talk about this and if we change our political projects. But it's going to be a lot of work.
Let's talk about some of the cast of characters, because a perfect example of somebody who is kind of suffering in the way that you describe is Pete Hegseth, who is now running the Department of Defense, was in the military, but recently found fame as a Fox News weekend host. He's very much on the far right. He has these kind of nationalist tattoos. He allegedly has a drinking problem, and clearly there are kind of mental health issues there. But the thing that interests me most, Jared, about him and others is that when Donald Trump says, I want you to be the Department of Defense, he says, okay. I mean, the total lack of self-awareness. You or I would be like, you know something, we're not really experienced enough. I mean, there's quite a big job. You're also, the second in command, military codes or nuclear codes. You really would be better finding somebody who's like a general or who's done this before or who has experience. So, I'm just a TV guy, just leave me out, and thanks very much for the offer. Those are the kind of normal responses you would expect from somebody who was self-aware and lived in reality. But somebody like Hegseth, who to me seems so unwell, that he would accept this challenge and take it on, and then go banning transgender people from the military and, I want to talk about Russia in just a moment, but taking the orders from Trump, which is to, stop looking for Russian cybersecurity issues. I mean, this is terrifying stuff. And positioning the U.S. for war, which is how the rhetoric that he kind of describes. So can we talk to him and people like him who are willing to accept these jobs despite being completely unsuitable?
Well, I want to start, I'm sure that we'll get into this during our conversation. Pete Hegseth is not just unqualified to be the Secretary of Defense. He has become the Secretary of Defense in one of the most consequential moments in American and modern history. If you take a look at actual history, and if you start tracing through, it becomes incredibly clear that we are on the precipice of World War III. We are on the precipice of a giant existential problem right now, and there are a variety of reasons for that, which we can talk about. But in that case, to just elevate a TV host who is completely unqualified, first of all, shows how little that Donald Trump actually thinks about the workings of government and how he's just looking for sycophants. And you'll notice something within Trump's circle, which is the losers that he surrounds himself with.
Right.
It is an absolute freak show of people who all are, and quite frankly, this is one of the wildest things about it, and I'm sure the people who watch your show feel like this. To watch Pete Hegseth talk, to watch Donald Trump talk, to watch Elon Musk talk, any of them, Rudy Giuliani, you name it, to hear them talk, the soul recoils, right? You look at these people and you say, these people are fundamentally unwell. There's something wrong here. And I've talked about this for a while. And I think it's essential in understanding why someone like Pete Hegseth would do this, or why Donald Trump would do it, or any of these people would do it, which is, I think most of us have in our families, in our friend circles, in our workplaces, we're surrounded by insecure men. And these are insecure men who overcompensate for their insecurity by gloating, by bragging, by making themselves larger than they are. And, you'll be in a room with them as they brag about, who they are, how much money they make, how successful they are, how cool they are, their sexual conquest, whatever it is. And the moment they leave the room, everybody else in the room in hushed voices says, I feel so bad for him.
Yeah.
right? And the problem here is that we're not just facing an illiberal movement, but at the heart of all these illiberal movements, there are insecure men who feel like they are failures, who feel like they haven't actually succeeded in what they've done. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Adolf Hitler was a failed painter, right? And if you look around the right-wing manosphere or media, it's a bunch of people who wanted to be Hollywood scriptwriters and failed. They wanted to be comedians and they failed. They were rejected in their pursuits and the things that they thought they deserved. And so what ends up happening is that you have this terrible cycle, and it's no coincidence that anti-democratic movements are also patriarchal movements, which want to hurt women, which want to reduce their rights, which want to create a society in which white men are given all the power and privileges. And all of a sudden you start to see society and political culture start to shift around those things. And unfortunately, we are at the whims and mercy of the people who are most unwell in this society and who have taken jobs they don't deserve, that they can't do. We've already seen it start to break apart. And unfortunately, instead of looking in the mirror, it is continually projected onto everybody else, which is everybody else is the problem. And then you double down and triple down and things get worse over time. So Pete Hegseth is a really, really tragic, troubling figure if you take a look at who he is and his record. But knowing that this is happening at one of the most essential moments in modern history, it makes it that much more disturbing.
Let's talk about the world order, because you're a bit of an expert in this subject. It's something that in previous conversations, maybe people refer to it as a conspiracy, this new world order. But this is very much what these tech oligarchs have been working towards. And, people need to understand the history behind Elon Musk and the people he has associated with. We've spoken about Peter Thiel before, but, that he was in business with him, with PayPal. PayPal, they wanted to be an alternative currency to the US dollar, but that didn't really work out, so it became a kind of transactional software. But their intentions for decades have been to take over the world. And it seems like the stuff of science fiction or Hollywood, because they do represent the baddies in the screenplay. But, I watch a lot of Peter Thiel interviews. He goes on a lot of podcasts and stuff, and his rhetoric is so terrifying because he seems to say it in such a relaxed fashion, which is why people are less concerned that it's a danger. Whereas, with Hitler speeches, we're used to him like shouting into the microphone, and people are like, oh, that's obviously the bad guy. But a lot of these guys are quite mild-mannered. They're extremely wealthy. Their influence through tech and military tech, in his case, are such that they do have an awful lot of power behind the scenes. And so you mix his brand with the Project 2025 people, Kevin Roberts, and then Leonard Leo with the Supreme Court, and even people on the Supreme Court. Clarence Thomas, as we know, people who hold very similar views about this shift in world order, has resulted in Donald Trump taking the side of Vladimir Putin and the Russians in this war with Ukraine. I mean, that is a shift that nobody was really expecting, but those of us who have, done our research were never going to be surprised.
Yeah, it was pretty clear. I mean, I wrote about it in the Midnight Kingdom, to listen to the tech oligarchs. The plan was to always create something that was under their control. For a while, it was the idea of digital spaces. Metaverse was basically, and not just a failure, but it was the idea of creating a universe in which Mark Zuckerberg and the people around him could control it like digital gods.
Right.
And if you actually take a look at what has happened, and I want to make a couple of points because I feel like sometimes some of this gets lost in the minutia, right? And so there is more or less right now something very strange that is happening, which is, we've been under the attack of a wealth class around the world. These are the people who fund the think tanks and institutes such as the Heritage Foundation. They put together Project 2025. This group of people has been interested in deregulating everything, basically destroying the federal government or controlling it, creating their own sort of libertarian pro-wealth society. They want to destroy public education. They more or less destroyed science and reality itself, right? That was their entire point. The side effect of doing what they did, they redistributed tens of trillions of dollars over the past few decades to the 1% of the population. And eventually this tech oligarch class started to emerge because they started merging with the federal government. There's hardly a thing that the federal government did even before Donald Trump was elected that wasn't facilitated through the major tech companies, which continued to flood them with billions upon billions of dollars, eventually even handing over things like the space agency and national security to people like Elon Musk.
I mean, how did that even happen? It's like we missed a whole decade where Elon Musk suddenly got all of these NASA contracts.
And for the record, there is more than enough blame to go around.
Yeah.
In the wake of the war on terror, as American empire grew, suddenly the federal government needed the help of the tech industry in order to make that work. And as we kept deregulating and privatizing, these people kept getting these contracts. So it's better to understand that these people are different from the wealth class that we're used to. Most people are hearing about the Kochs or Kevin Roberts or, those types of people. They just want to make money, and they just want to get rid of the federal government and get regulation out of the way. The tech oligarchs have a different worldview. I mean, this is one of the reasons why they're destroying the economy right now. They literally want to get away from the U.S. dollar. They want to go ahead and gobble up as many resources as they possibly can. And as we're talking, as the seconds tick away, Elon Musk and, a cadre of like people who are probably late for homeroom in high school are recalculating how the government works. They're rigging up all of the different apparatus with their AI that's under their control. They are carrying out a coup. And if you take a look at these people, we can get lost in the bells and whistles of the digital age, right? Like we have a real problem with things like the internet and social media because they're ethereal. You can't touch them. They don't feel real. But these are the industrialists of the modern age. They created this economy and the way things work. Exactly as the industrialists of the early 20th century were building buildings and putting railroads and creating this sort of like oil-based infrastructure, right? And guess what happened when they gained all of the power and the wealth? They looked around and they said, you know what? Democracy doesn't work for me. I have all this money. I have all this wealth. Why does some Joe Schmo off the street have a vote that cancels out my vote? And eventually, and this is one of the untold stories of history, the reason why you have the fascists, the reason why you have the Nazis, the reason why you have fascists within the United States of America, which actually, people don't know this, tried to overthrow FDR in the United States government. They backed those fascists. They worked in tandem with them because they wanted to destroy liberal democracy and take what they thought was rightfully theirs. We're in the middle of that power grab. And one of the issues is that they just kind of looked at these people as if they were IT. They were worshipped as digital messiahs. Right. They were going to make everybody incredibly wealthy and make, all the machines
work. They were superheroes.
But what happened was that we missed the opportunity to regulate them.
Yeah.
We let them create digital spaces that are as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than what the cigarette manufacturers did in the 20th century. Worse than what, the opioid producers created in the 20th century. They've hurt us, they've helped destroy democracy, and they've put them in a position where they look around and they don't see any guardrails anymore. They're making their move because they want to move beyond the nation state. You and I are talking about the United States of America and nations. They don't want nations anymore. They want to have what they call network states in which they have total control. There's no oversight, no regulation, and nation states are reduced basically to becoming support apparatuses so that they can launder and filter our taxes and any sort of money that comes through as they rig the economy and rig the law. It is a different situation. And it is evolving by the day, but if people don't understand what's actually occurring, I don't think they're going to understand the threat that we're facing, which is more or less techno-feudalism. There's really no other way to put it.
It's a big ask, though, isn't it? Considering that half of Americans read lower than a fifth grade child level.
Which is not an accident, for the record.
Right.
Because
Indeed,
the wealth class that we've been talking about, they've been waging a war on public education since desegregation in the 1950s.
Yeah.
That's why they want to get rid of public education, is because they don't want government oversight. And for the record, we've even seen it take place at this point. They have hollowed out education in order to get rid of critical thinking skills. And whenever people ask me, can you believe that people believe conspiracy theories? Can you believe they believe, all of these lies that Trump tells? I say, of course I can. They ran a search and destroy mission on public education and created the perfect situation for this. And if we do not understand that public education, with the rise of liberal democracy, was an attempt to get rid of the mystification of feudalism, in which you didn't understand hurricanes, you didn't understand diseases, you were at the whims of kings and lords, and the only thing you knew was what the church told you in conjunction with the kings and lords. That is one of the main pillars of a liberal democratic society, is educating people. And, as we've been talking, I don't know by the time that this airs if the Department of Education will still exist. And that is not a coincidence. That's part of this larger project, and it always has been.
It's so difficult, isn't it, to translate this enormous story into simple language, because it isn't simple. And, I try really hard to make this type of information more accessible, because I think part of our job as hosts or podcasters or authors is to communicate the message and explain and expose. But there are so many strands to this, because we could talk for 2 hours just on the education subject. But is it even possible to have an overarching conversation about how many things are being destroyed in order for this new world order to take shape? Because I've started to use language which I never really wanted to, and that is joining up what this ideology is all about. And to me, its greatest connection is with Nazism, because so many of the characters involved are, it seems to me, Nazis, Nazi sympathizers. Mm-hmm. And we've seen that with, the recent Hitler salutes from Elon Musk. He did it twice, incidentally. Steve Bannon then did it too. That they really are talking to this alt-right fascist supporter that is has infiltrated, or maybe has always been there, in amongst American society. Is it fair to draw that comparison, or is it just too extreme for the kind of, for a modern conversation?
Well, to answer your first point, and this is something, I'm so glad you brought this up. The only reason I'm sitting here having this conversation with you right now is because I come from a working class family in one of those towns that was hollowed out, and I went to college. I accrued so much student debt. It was the only way that I could do it, where I was taught how to research. I was taught how to synthesize things. The only reason I was able to write these books is because I worked at a university and I had access to other professors and subject experts, as well as a whole slew of subscription-based research tools, right? So information has become siloed. It's not that people are stupid. It's that people work with stereotypes. They're not necessarily taught how to do this thing. They don't have the time to do it. They don't have the training to do it. And so one of the issues, and this has been something, I didn't feel comfortable in my working class world. I didn't feel comfortable in the academic world. I have to figure out how to bridge those gaps, how to talk to both, in order to sort of code switch as I'm doing it. Making it simple is essential. And to answer what you brought up secondly, we are very lucky for something. I remember watching on the day of the inauguration as Elon Musk threw out a Nazi salute. And at first I was horrified. And then on the other hand, I was relieved. And I was relieved for this reason. They're not even hiding it anymore.
Right.
And there's something about that. These people, they are Nazi sympathizers. They are authoritarians through and through. They're white supremacists. They're eugenicists. Like, the things that they say and the things that they do in the past used to be hidden through crypto-Nazi messaging, right? Like they learned how to sort of hide those things and put a mask on. they're not worried about the mask anymore, which I think speaks to their level of overconfidence. And I don't think that it is extreme to compare them to fascists and Nazis, because they are in a long line and tradition of fascists and Nazis. And if you look at it, it's the same through line. It's the same conspiracy theories. It's the same ideology. And for the record, it's the same goals. And if that is the means to get through to people, that's one way to do it. But the second part is this. You know what people understand? They understand if suddenly their school doesn't have funds. They understand if suddenly they go to the store and why in the world is everything so much more expensive, or why are the shelves bare, right? Why all of a sudden, are we watching all these layoffs that are going to cause recessions in cities and towns, right? I keep explaining it as an avalanche coming down the mountain. It's as if Washington, D.C. is this giant mountain that we all live at the base of, and we can see the avalanche coming. It's going to get here. And when it hits, and when that pain starts to really be accrued, it is very simple, Anthony. The richest man in the world and the richest men in the world have taken control of the government. And guess what? That is one of the rhetorical devices that even Donald Trump used with the MAGA movement. The rich people are getting richer. They're screwing you. People are betraying you. So to make it that simplistic, if we move beyond red versus blue rhetoric and paradigms, for the record, the average person on the street, they don't know what's happening with the budget deal right now. They don't know that, that's for political sickos. That's the stuff that we pay attention to, right? You know what they understand? The richest man in the world is acting a fool and is the president at this point, and is taking control, and he's taking all of the money and he's taking it from you. And I think that there's a survival instinct in this that repels from it. And so we do have to simplify it, but we're very lucky in that the simplified answer is also the answer. It also tells us what's happening.
The way that Trump handled Zelensky in the Oval Office was also another example of this, and very telling. It was an ambush. It was a setup. Trump has an end game with Ukraine, and that is that he clearly needs to do whatever Putin has requested of him. And that would be, I guess, to annex portions of the territory, a sovereign territory, and hand that to Russia. And really, to get to that point, we're all just playing a whole bunch of games now. They had a ceasefire meeting in Qatar where Trump's people Rubio announced, that Zelensky has agreed to a ceasefire. And no one seemed to mention that the Ukrainians weren't the aggressors in this war, that it was Russia that attacked Ukraine. So the fact that they're trying to completely rewrite that narrative before our very eyes, it's like we're slow walking into the end game that everybody knows where it's going to end and nobody wants it to happen, but we're like walking through treacle to get there. It's extremely frustrating. Putin is enjoying this no end because he hasn't really had to do a thing. He's just stepping back and watching the Americans screw it up. How did you feel when you saw that interplay with Trump and Vance and Zelensky and Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend shouting things out about Zelensky's clothes? Did you recoil as the rest of us did?
I was nauseous. I watched it, and something really sunk in with me, which was, I've been warning for a while about the decline of American empire and American order. Since the post-World War II era, the United States of America has tried to operate as a hegemon, to basically control everything in the world through military, political, and economic means. And for the record, that is not a sterling record. Part of the issue we're here is because the United States of America abused its power, abused people, exploited people, killed people, destabilized regimes, and by the way, made one deal after another with dictators who killed, disappeared, and manipulated their people. We didn't just arrive here, right? This is the evolution of a long, long slide to this point. But for me, it was something that made it abundantly clear that we had reached the tipping point. I knew immediately that everyone around the world who recognizes this would see that the United States wasn't just flirting with Vladimir Putin and Russia, but that we were embracing them. We were allying ourselves with them. And just a quick aside before I finish, I want to point out, before things like world wars, there's a picking of sides. You start to see where people land, and it's hard for Americans to wrap their head around the idea that we are aligning right now through Donald Trump and everybody around him with the modern day Axis. That's what's happening at this point. But there's something visceral about this, Anthony. And there's a reason why the majority of Americans are not like all of these right-wing ideologues who are on their absolutely insane podcast and video shows, right? And that is this. If you see a big guy picking on a little guy and beating him, you root for the little guy.
Yeah.
You see what's right and wrong, and everybody knows that Russia invaded Ukraine. Everybody knows that this isn't fair. And to watch Zelensky go into the White House, and again, it echoed there. It was Donald Trump insulting him. It was J.D. Vance, who I think is one of the most dismal, disgusting people in public life, then berating him. It was then the media making fun of him. There's something instinctual inside of us that goes beyond politics. It goes beyond culture. It goes beyond everything, which is we look at that and we recognize who the victim is. We recognize who is in the crosshairs of a larger bullying and a larger invasion and attack. And so I do think that that was one of those moments where, for all this talk about Donald Trump being, a provocative leader or soon he'll become president, I think it became shockingly and stunningly clear exactly where we were. I don't think that makes it permanent. I think we can pull away from this cliff and the abyss. I think America can move back to a different side of this fight, but I do think that there was something stunning in that moment, something very, very metaphorical and instinctual about it, that I think as we watched it, I was glad it happened. I was glad that it made it, it cut to the bone. It showed what was actually occurring in this entire situation. But I thought it was one of the most disgraceful sort of public moments in modern American history.
For Americans, it looked like bullying, punching down, and all of the things that are not great. But to Europeans, it meant something completely different. And this is really where I'm getting to with this, is that it was a line in the sand for the EU, for our NATO allies, for the transatlantic alliance. They were like, hang on a second, something has now changed. And it was so sad because it also came off the back of that appalling speech that was made at the Munich Security Conference by J.D. Vance, the announcement at the NATO summit by Pete Hegseth that the U.S. would no longer be providing security guarantees to Europeans. The whole thing was a terrible week for the alliance that we have enjoyed since 1941 when America entered the Second World War. And so now we have Ursula von der Leyen and others getting up and saying, okay, we as Europeans are now going to have to invest in our own military. We can't rely on the Americans anymore. Strangely, it's pushed the UK closer back to Europe despite Brexit, which could be a good thing, but it will certainly mean a military alliance there. Just try and explain how Europe is going to move forward now, potentially without the US. Because I had a bad dream thinking, well, maybe Europe will expel America from NATO, which America created.
Yeah, so I want to touch on something and then get into the larger thing, because one of the issues here, and you'd brought up Brexit. And when Brexit took place in 2016, I think it was a wake-up call, and people need to remember that was before the election of Donald Trump. And it was this moment of what are the Brits doing? What is happening here? And over time, what we've seen, and I've always been referring to the international authoritarian movement. It's as Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs around him and within the United States of America, they all got on the same page, which was we need to create a liberal societies in which we gorge ourselves on wealth and resources, and everybody else can live in this sort of captured surveillance dictatorial state. Well, it wasn't just in the United States. all of the so-called Western nations started losing ground to these people. Donald Trump was elected in 2016, and what have we seen around the world? We've seen the growth of far-right parties that spread the same conspiracy theories, the same white supremacist ideology. They're in lockstep with Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. That was a result of the fact that liberal politicians around the world did not meet the moment. Right? They actually, and this is one of the more upsetting parts about it, they actually moved to the right. And we're seeing that with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party right now is in this weird little situation where they're flirting with moving to the right, and becoming more and more like the Republican Party. And that was a concern because I looked at Canada, I looked at Great Britain, I looked at France, I looked at Germany, and every election result and every poll showed that the far right was starting to gain ground and that they were eventually going to overtake sort of the neoliberal politicians. But what has happened in the past couple of weeks was something that I don't think was obvious, which is the repulsion towards Donald Trump and the understanding that their own personal security was being put at risk because of Trump and because of Vladimir Putin. You've seen a rise in a sort of consciousness that it was there, but it wasn't. It wasn't at the forefront. You'll notice that all of the countries I've been listing, Anthony, they were all talking about immigration. They were all talking about needing to deport people, and you were seeing Alternative for Deutschland starting to grow. You were starting to see Le Pen gain favor and purchase in France. Canada was starting to see the conservatives, become more MAGA-like and gain power. But there's been a shift.
Right.
And I think this is something that people have discounted, which is there are opposite reactions to authoritarian overreach. And this goes back to one of the underlying themes that we've been talking about, which is there's no patience with these authoritarians. There's no nuance, right? They don't feel like they need to hide it anymore. So as a result, backlash grows. We're seeing it in Europe where they're starting to take these things seriously, right? They're actually starting to put their money where their mouths are. And on top of that, we're seeing it in the United States of America where this rage and backlash is building, but we don't know yet where to put it or how to harness it or where to direct it.
Well, because we don't have leadership.
Exactly. And I just want to make a quick comment because we always need to look back at history. Conventional histories tell us about authoritarian movements such as Nazism and fascism, right? And in those, they just kind of happen in a vacuum. Somebody gives a powerful speech and all of a sudden everybody is underneath a mystical spell. And then suddenly you have a dictatorial society. That's not actually how it occurs. There is a period between when it emerges and when it takes total control and becomes a total existential threat. There is a back and forth here. And what we're seeing right now is a sort of a grasping of what's taking place. And we're watching political and cultural sortings that sort of react to these things. I personally have been emboldened by seeing what's happening in Europe. But I will say, as a word of warning, we're basically about to watch 8 or 9 separate arms races start to take off.
Yeah.
And when you start going down that path, if you have an arms race, war becomes not just more likely, it becomes increasingly likely, right? It starts to become almost an inevitability. We have choices that we can make, and we have coalitions that we can build to stave this off before we reach some sort of species-threatening war. But I am emboldened by the fact that people are starting to recognize what's going on, and we're starting to see some of those shifts.
I'm pleased that we can take this in a optimistic direction. We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and expand on that and look to solutions and look to see how the US needs to realign in order to stamp out this rise of authoritarianism. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. The secret weapon is a great asset to have in your back pocket. It helps you get ahead in life. And that's how Mack Weldon thinks about clothing as a secret weapon, timeless classic style that's infused with performance fabrics and hidden details. Whether you're looking for light as air underwear, anti-odor tees, or sweaters with lightweight warmth, Mack Weldon has a full range of clothes that feel comfortable all day long and never go out of style. I love these black tees that I wear from Mack Weldon. They're comfortable. They allow me to breathe without getting hot and sweaty despite my environment. Some people want to look good without calling attention to themselves. Well, Mack Weldon apparel gives you understated looks for understated confidence. They're not flashy, just classic, always in style, and made from the world's most comfortable performance materials. Mack Weldon clothes are designed to fit your style and demands of modern life. They look like regular clothes, but they feel like the latest in modern comfort. Get timeless looks with modern comfort from Mack Weldon. Go to mackweldon.com and get 25% off your first order of $125 or more with promo code WEEKEND. That's MackWeldon.com. Promo code WEEKEND. So, it's a new year, 2025, and you're thinking, how am I going to make this year different? Am I going to build something for myself? I'm dying to be my own boss, or see if I can turn this business idea I've been kicking around into a reality. But I just don't know how to make it happen. Shopify is how you're going to make it happen, and let me tell you how. The best time to start your new business is right now, and Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. Get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates, no coding or design skills required. All you need to do is drag and drop. Their powerful social media tools let you connect all of your channels and create shoppable posts to help you sell everywhere that people scroll. Shopify makes it easy to manage your growing business. They help with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard, allowing you to focus on the important stuff like growing your business. With Shopify, your first sale is closer than you think. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/weekend, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/weekend to start selling with Shopify today. That's shopify.com/weekend. We're back on The Weekend Show with Jared Yates Sexton. I'm Anthony Davis. Jared, a story that kind of happened in this last week that didn't really get much attention was a North Sea tanker that turned out to be Russian, that kind of crashed into a cargo ship, and there was a huge spillage, and the UK were kind of heavily involved in this because of the North Sea and, you know, the UK waters and all of that. But to me, I saw that and I was like, this is as a result of the instability that we have with Russia and Europe and Ukraine and the United States. And I think they're investigating this as we speak. And, you know, they didn't initially know that the captain of the tanker was a Russian, and he's been detained now on suspicion of gross negligence. And it was the U.S. Navy that was operating the oil tanker that it crashed into. But I connected this to this announcement that cybersecurity, looking at Russia, was, you know, that the Americans were going to stop doing that. And I was like, why would you do that? Like, why would you do that? And, you know, there was talk of this ship being controlled by GPS, and I'm not sure that that's true. But to me, it all seemed connected in a kind of geopolitical way. And I was thinking, you know, what is the effect of this upset that we've seen in world politics since Donald Trump was elected in just, you know, a couple of months, and starting to see these types of things and events happen is something that we might have to get used to. The precursor to something more serious, maybe. Yeah,
so to give the larger picture and then to zoom in the post-war era that we were just talking about, basically what occurred was that the response to fascism and Nazism in the post-war era, and also what was seen as the threat of the Soviet Union, the United States of America used its newfound power and riches and also support of Europe. Basically, Europe was like, hey, you take capitalism and run with it, and we'll just go along and we'll figure it out. The American order that has been in place since the 1940s was trying to create a liberal economic order in which, you know, free trade was being established. The crowning achievement of that was globalism. It created this sort of idea that we're not going to go to war with each other. We're not going to have these big giant conflicts because we're all going to be working together and we're all going to be making money together. Meanwhile, within the body of that apparatus, there was a poison. And the poison was ingested from the moment that they attempted to do this. Immediately after the war ended, the United States was like, hey, former Nazis, can you help us build rockets? Fantastic. Former fascists, can you kill some communists over in Europe and make sure that they can't win elections or gain any sort of power? Fantastic. Oh, by the way, we'll have a dictator over here. Yeah, they'll kill some people and they're going to make lives absolutely hellish for their subjects. Oh, we'll have another dictator. Oh, well, we didn't like that election. We'll overthrow that election. That's totally fine. There's a hubris to that. This entire idea that the American world order, we now call it globalism, whatever it is, there was an idea that this was going to be a Pax Americana that was going to last forever. And, you know, I started doing this research for the Midnight Kingdom, and I started reading all these memos and security reports that were taking place at the end of the last millennium. And every party and every individual and every politician was like, we will never have another rival for the history of the world. The United States of America will secure all these resources and do all these things. Meanwhile, the poison that I was talking about, you can't have that and not expect that order to fall apart at some point. Like the invasion of Ukraine, not supposed to happen. You're not supposed to have major nation states invading their neighbors.
Well, there was an agreement in place that the Americans would protect the Ukrainians in return for them dropping their nuclear arsenal. I mean, that has been completely ignored.
But guess what? That couldn't even be like respected, because when we were rebuilding Russia after the Soviet Union fell, we looked at this Vladimir Putin fella and we thought, you know what? He's a dictator who we can work with.
Yeah.
And guess what? He's going to create all these oligarchs around him who are going to steal public funds, but as long as we're getting their oil and as long as they cooperate in the global system. Meanwhile, what happens? We get to the point where they invade Ukraine. Well, we put sanctions on them, right? We start holding their money. Their blood money is one of the main nutritional supplements of the world economy. You can't stamp them out. And then all of a sudden you start working with somewhere like China. And what did we do with China, an authoritarian country? We made a deal with them so they would give us cheap goods where they would put their people into slave-like labor. Well, you start making deals with the devil and eventually those deals catch up with you. The splintering of the American global economy was always going to happen. And so now we've reached a point where all of these things we've taken for granted are starting to fall apart. You know, we saw it during COVID when all of a sudden we had supply problems. All of a sudden we couldn't produce PPE fast enough. Then we look around and you know, I don't want to worry anybody who's listening to this at their airport gate. We don't even know if the airplane that we're on is going to make it to the destination in one piece. So things are starting to splinter. And the problem here is not just that people are going to die and suffer and we have the possibility of war, but when a major order starts to splinter the way the American order is splintering, there's incredible instability. Things start happening that aren't supposed to happen. And that's the type of disruption that Vladimir Putin took advantage of. And for anyone who wants to learn more about this, go look at somebody named Alexander Dugin, who inspired Steve Bannon and Curtis Yarvin and all these people who've created these ideologies. They saw that the American order was ripe for destruction. And they saw that they could invade Ukraine and there wasn't going to be some sort of major war. There wasn't going to be like this sort of retaliation that, that I think was necessary at that point. And so what ends up occurring is we're currently in the death of one era. We're in the death of one epoch and we're entering another. And the bad news here is that a lot of really terrible things can happen when that occurs, whether or not it's suddenly having measles outbreaks or not being able to get electricity and water or food. The good news is that in these moments, they're malleable. You can take something in the past that didn't work, something that felt concrete. And, you know, we've heard that forever, which is that you can't destroy neoliberalism. You can't move beyond it. Now we're in a period of disruption where we can take advantage of that malleability and we can create a better world. And we have to stop holding on to this conservative idea that the world before Donald Trump was perfect. Healthcare in this country doesn't work. Public education in this country doesn't work. The way we exploit people around the world is grotesque. The war crimes, the atrocities that we put up with, it's wrong. The way we have second-class citizens, we have an apartheid state, you know, the incarceral state, whatever it is, the economy.
Well, we talk of high-speed rail like it's science fiction.
Can you imagine?
Normal everywhere else.
So the good news here is that And we don't tend to look at it this way.
Mm.
We tend to see authoritarianism and regression almost as inevitability at this point, in part because the people carrying out want to convince us that we can't defeat them and that we're powerless to defeat them. But the good news is through this destruction, we can actually create something. We can actually build something that's better. So that is why we're in this position, but we also need to recognize it and take advantage of it the same way that authoritarians do.
This is all great material for a democratic leader to rise. I mean, there's so much to work with right now. And that's why I guess it's so frustrating that we see Chuck Schumer struggling to negotiate the continuing resolution with Mike Johnson, who's easily manipulated. It's this power vacuum on the left is extremely frustrating. And look, Donald Trump let slip in the Oval Office the other day. He said that the EU was created to screw America. I mean, these lines are gold for Democrats because I don't think Americans really believe that. I don't think that type of language has really been used in the public domain. This is stuff that's coming straight from the Kremlin. It's like a press release that Trump is reading. And that's the stuff that Democrats could work with. So maybe we could talk to Democratic leadership or the lack thereof, and who could potentially fill this void. Because I know that without a parliamentary system here, we don't seem to allow leaders to present themselves unless we're in an election cycle, which, there's no law to that. I mean, that needs to be thrown out, and someone needs to step up soon.
Yes, I'll be honest and I'll be frank. I think I hesitate to even use the word response to Trump because it hasn't been a response. It's been worthless.
Yeah,
it's been abysmal and embarrassing. And I want to give an explanation of why that is, and also get into what you just said, which I think is 100% correct. The leadership of the Democratic Party at this point, they are the people who created this situation in the first place. So essentially, the Democratic Party has become a conservative party. If you hear what they say, and this goes back to the 2024 election and everything around it, basically, they're trying to save what hasn't already been destroyed, right? Which is, well, yeah, the majority of civil rights have been repealed, and yeah, we got rid of Roe v. Wade. Everything else is going to be destroyed if we don't become conservative, right? And instead, what actually needs to happen is we need to hear how the world should be. Not how the world was, not how the world is. People are looking for leadership. People are looking for vision. And the Democratic Party has been in lockstep with billionaire donors. That has been their main fundraising base outside of the base that, gives them their small donations. And guess what? Those billionaire donors at this point, they kind of want what Donald Trump is doing. They want a society that serves them. And the others, they're just afraid of giving money and getting spotlit by Donald Trump. So what we're actually watching with the Democratic Party right now, they're not talking to their base. They're not talking to their voters. They're trying to keep their fundraisers home. They're trying to keep their friendly billionaires to keep them from seeing them as dangerous and wild-eyed, right? And we're seeing examples of just absolutely disgusting leadership isn't even the word. Gavin Newsom with Charlie Kirk and now Steve Bannon, and obviously has made a decision to try and work with these people. Hakeem Jeffries, if we lived in a society in which our politics work, Hakeem Jeffries would have resigned by now. And so there is an active political courage that needs to take place, which is you either stand for something or you stand for nothing. And going around worrying about what focus groups tell you, you change public opinion. And if you actually look at polls in the United States of America, everybody says we're divided. Well, yeah, we are. But when you look at the issues, we're not. People want women to have reproductive rights. People want schools to be funded. They want things to change. They want better health care. There is a waiting majority in this country that is waiting on somebody to be courageous and bold and lead us toward the future as opposed to dragging us back into the past. And I have to tell you, I do think that vacuum will be answered. The question at this point is whether or not the Democratic leadership, because they're concerned about those donors, if they will go after them. And we've seen that with Bernie Sanders. We've seen that disruption take place. But I also want to put something on the end of this, Anthony, which is we've been talking about politics at a level that most of your viewers right now have no agency whatsoever. They can't be in the White House standing up for Vladimir Zelensky, right? They can't go over to the EU and talk about creating a new alliance against this stuff. We can't wait on the Democratic Party to save us. We can't wait for our institutions to save us, our media to save us. If we want a leader and if we want a party that reflects what we care about, we have to speak out. We have to protest. We have to carry out collective action. And history tells us that movements that actually change things, that actually create social revolutions, they don't begin in offices. They begin with getting in the street, working with one another, carrying out walkouts and strikes and saying enough is enough. And so if we want a leader in a party that is actually going to reflect our principles and what we want, we have to demand it. And the Democratic Party has shown we can't just wait on that. We can't just wait around hoping that they'll speak out their convictions, because more and more we're seeing the party at war with itself and starting to move that Overton window more and more towards the right to try and put a happy face on it, even though it's open authoritarianism and fascism.
I wrote a Substack essay last week entitled, "It's Time for the Democrats to Woke Up." And the point that I'm trying to make is that you really need to lean in to inclusivity, because there's a gap in the market for it. And I suppose there was a fear that Kamala Harris had gone too far into trans rights and forgot about white men. I don't really buy into that in the same way. I believe that now there is this vacuum because Donald Trump is basically banning anybody who doesn't look like him or Elon Musk from working in the federal government. And the rhetoric surrounding minorities and immigrants, referring to illegals and referring to trans people who identify as female as Mr. This is not normal, but it is also not acceptable, I think, to the majority of Americans. And that's what the Democrats have to work with. And as you said, there is this fear that we all have that the Democrats think that the realignment is to move to the right. My point is that they need to go much further to the left. And 3 words, Bernie was right.
And I couldn't agree more. And for the record, there is an essential part of this, which is, you know how you defeat authoritarianism? You defeat it by talking about the interconnected fates of people. Authoritarians divide us. They use all these cudgels. And for the record, everything from trans panic to the conspiracy theories around it, whether it's DEI, CRT, kindergartners with kitty litter boxes in their classrooms, right?
Yeah.
Every single one of those was cooked up by a think tank or an institute that does the bidding of billionaires. And they did that because it keeps us fighting about issues that don't actually exist. They're emotionally activating issues that they take over inherent prejudices and worldviews, right? For Christians, it's a persecution complex. For racists, it's racial paranoia. And the only way to actually defeat this is to point something out, which is, how's your wallet doing? Oh, it's not doing well. Well, you need to understand that as long as this group over here is being scapegoated, as long as people of color, as long as women, as long as immigrants, as long as anybody is being scapegoated, that is affecting your life. That actually hurts you. You look at something, and I was so upset about the lack of response from the Democratic Party and the Harris campaign. It was during that disgusting period in which that town in Ohio, they were talking about Haitian immigrants, eating their pets.
Dogs, yeah.
Well, you know what? That town relied on immigrants for their economy.
Right.
It wasn't just that was a lie. It was that it was disrespecting people who were essential to the economy. And what's taking place around the country right now? Why are there so many immigrants in this country? Because wealthy people exploit them. because they can pay them cents on the dollar and they don't ask for rights or Social Security or 401ks, right? So if you actually start talking about the class elements of this and you stop, sort of tiptoeing around taking care of people, and for the record, I think it's disgusting the way that we've seen Democrats blame trans people for their electoral losses, the way that they've competed to be harder on immigration, and that's a failure. That is an absolute failure. What you have to do is to change the conversation. You need to stop fighting on Republican terms, because you're not going to win an election being the light version of the Republican Party. You are ceding so much ground and you're going to lose, and then, do an episode of Pod Save America in which you're like, well, we did everything we could,
Right.
The truth is that we have to talk about the material conditions. We have to talk about the fact that this is actually a class war. This isn't a culture war. It's a class war in which the wealthy are taking all of the power and all of the wealth. And the people who are voting for it are going to suffer as much as anybody else, because they're allowing those divisions and those cudgels to take control of the political landscape. And so we do have to change the way that we talk about this and the way that we approach it.
I mean, humanity is the answer, isn't it? To be on the side of humanity,
yes,
rather than on the side of the oligarchy. And I think it's going to present, there is going to be a split, like a parting of the Red Sea in the coming months. The red side is very much going to be, the Russians with Trump and his broligarchs in that camp. And they will become increasingly isolated by the European leadership, Zelensky, Ukraine, etc. Because if you look at the demands that Putin has put forward for this, for his version of the ceasefire, I mean, it hasn't really changed since the very beginning. He doesn't want Ukraine to become part of NATO. He doesn't want any kind of European boots on the ground. He wants Crimea to be recognized as Russia. I mean, he hasn't really changed his tune. If Trump jumps into those demands, throws in the towel and says, okay, Mr. Putin, you're going to get what you want. It's like people, I think, are going to join the dots. Now we know what they were talking about in that private meeting in Helsinki where there was only an interpreter present. Now we know, what the quid pro quo is. And so I do believe that by osmosis there will be this kind of separation of good against evil, and it'll be a choice for where people choose to stand.
I completely agree. And I think going back to what I was talking about with the equal and opposite reaction, I think we do ourselves a disservice by thinking on electoral calendars. I see a lot of James Carville has nothing to add to any conversation anymore. It's like the Democrats should just play possum for the next 2 or 4 years.
Not very helpful.
Well, guess what? I've studied Putinist Russia. They still have elections. And you know who believes those elections? Nobody. And we currently have a government that is taking control of over absolutely everything at this point, and God knows what that's going to end up becoming. We have to stop waiting for 2026 and stop waiting for 2028. And there is a growing backlash in this country. And, that you see elements of it. People have said to me, what did you think about the public support for someone like Luigi Mangione? And I say it's a signal that there is a growing hatred of what the oligarchs are doing in this country. We can argue all day long about what happened, but the support of it reflects something that we've seen before, which is, back in the era of the robber barons, who the cultural heroes were? Gangsters.
Yeah.
They were the people who broke the law and took money from wealthy people, right? Bandits. Well, then you take a look at this consumer backlash against Tesla and Cybertrucks, and you can't see one of these things without just you can't even control your face at this point, right? You see that. You see the anger towards Elon Musk. You see the anger towards Donald Trump. And next, the economic consequences of this, the political and cultural consequences of what you're laying out, which is seeing a government that is obviously doing wrong and intends wrong, right? I do think that we're going to see a protest movement. I do think that we're going to see a popular movement against this. The question at this point, because I want to be honest about it, I don't want to, rain on anybody's parade. We've already seen in this country now what happens when you have a protest movement. Law enforcement is a domestic military that has domestic military weapons. The tech oligarchs are creating surveillance systems. I mean, just today, as we're recording this, we're finding out they're using AI to go after students who have said negative things on their social media for deportation. The question is, what will that clash bring? Right? Are we going to see paramilitary groups? And by the way, Anthony, they've already been pardoned for violence that they've done on behalf of Donald Trump when they tried to carry out a coup. And one of the things that we always notice with these regimes, law enforcement starts working with paramilitary groups. They start working with groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. There's a clash coming. I don't want to sugarcoat it. I don't want people thinking that we're simply going to, march out and suddenly everything's going to be fine. This is going to be a struggle. But knowing what I know about history, knowing what I know about these cycles, I'm optimistic because the backlash is growing, the energy is growing, and I think people have a will to make something different. But the whole question is, are we going to create the infrastructure to bring about that change? And are we going to meet the moment when it happens? Are we going to be ready to walk out? Are we going to be ready to go on strike? Are we going to be ready to go and protest and do these things? And we have to be prepared. And so if there's anything I want people to leave this with, it's that you are not alone. You are not powerless. You have the ability to affect change. You are not a spectator. No one is coming to save you. But if you link arms with other people, if you engage in solidarity, and what you just brought up, I think is exactly right, which is basic human empathy. Basic human ethical and morality. If you have the ability to stand with others and recognize that we're connected and you get in the fight, we're going to win this thing. It won't be easy, but we'll win this thing if we actually bring the fight to them.
Because those human qualities, Trump and Musk, they don't possess those.
No.
So, they can shut down USAID, which only costs 0.63% of the annual federal budget, and put millions of people, not just they're already in poverty, but into, to potentially kill these people because there will literally be no food supply. And it doesn't seem to bother them at all. That is, to me, as an example of one of the things that will mobilize this huge movement against cruelty. And we're starting to hear the word cruelty used to describe a lot of these actions that Musk and Trump are taking. Interestingly, in the UK, they announced on Thursday that they're going to be shutting down NHS England, which is like a kind of bureaucratic department that sits between the National Health Service and the government. And to me, there was kind of some similarities with USAID. But the thing that made it so interesting for me was that they announced that it was going to take 2 years to shut it down. And USAID was shut down in 24 hours. And that is really the difference between a functioning government making a decision that they seek to save waste, fraud, and abuse. Okay, it'll take 2 years. We'll wind this down. People, I think there's going to be quite a few layoffs, so they're going to have to give people the proper severance and all of these things. That is the difference between a functioning democracy and a dictatorship. And I'm hoping that people will start to realize that Donald Trump's whims and Elon Musk's algorithms and teenage hackers is not the way to find efficiency and improve a system that clearly needs improving, but it just has to be done in the right way.
Well, and USAID is a wonderful example. This is, for all intents and purposes, the largest organization that feeds people around the world.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I want to be honest about it. USAID has been used for some really awful things, during the American Empire. Like it is something that needs reformed. And, you look at other things and the CIA, the FBI, which have been responsible for unbelievable atrocities, right? And they're being purged and moved and changed. We have to understand something, and I think you just put your finger on it, which is we do need to reform our institutions. We do need to do something better about it. And guess what? Doing that in the circumstance that we've been referring to it as the American order, the American empire, whatever it is, it does need to change. And we shouldn't wrap our arms around the past and institutions and pretend that they're somehow or another perfect. And all we need to do is, take care of them. We need adult conversations about how to change these things. And if we were going to do this in an adult way, we would take time with it. We would weigh things. We would talk to experts. I mean, taking something like USAID and changing it would take years. It would years of planning. Right. And for instance, just very quickly, the tariffs that we're talking about, I happen to think that globalism is one of the worst things that we have done. And to simply start destroying it, I do think we need to move beyond globalism, but you would also need to create a manufacturing core within the United States of America. You would have to make sure that people had rights and protections, in those jobs. Inevitably, these tariffs, which are just wild based on, what Donald Trump had for lunch, all of a sudden
random numbers,
200%, let's go 300%,
Yeah.
That is so haphazard and so cruel that it can only result in abuses and damages. If you go ahead and get rid of importing anything or allowing people to buy things from other things from other countries, you're going to have to create a manufacturing class in which people are not going to get decent pay. They're not going to get protections, which is a precursor for getting rid of regulations and protections. So the destruction and the haphazardness is part of the point. Authoritarians create crises, and then they exploit those crises. And so what are we going to do? We have to create manufacturing. So, and on top of that, just to go ahead and put a note in here that hopefully someone will remember, the past that they want to reinstate, Anthony, it involves children in factories.
Yeah.
And we've already seen the Republican Party over the last few years start to relax child labor laws and start to put kids in slaughterhouses and in factories. So what's going to happen? We're going to have another moment where this crisis that they've created is going to then necessitate worse and worse solutions. So the destruction and the haphazardness, it's intentional. And it helps when you have a group of people that are carrying out. They don't care what happens to human beings. They don't care if people are not going to get their medicine, if they're going to go without food, if their kids are going to be put into, old triangle shirtwaist factory type situations. They don't care because those lives don't matter. The only thing that matters is their own empowerment and their own enrichment.
So again, this is another opportunity for Democrats. And I was thinking, instead of focusing on the institutions, to make it all about the people, make the messaging all about the people, which is going back to the rise of the unions, unionized workers. I think that there is room for that to have its moment again, because, we know about Amazon and factory workers and them fighting unionization in that sector. But I think that, to talk about people rather than businesses or organizations or institutions is going to be the solution for Democrats, because Democrats are people, and there are people who didn't vote for Donald Trump. Apparently there's 90 million people that didn't vote for Donald Trump, or who voted but their vote was purged through voter suppression. And so the movement that didn't vote for him is far greater than the movement that did. 70 million for Kamala Harris, and then somewhere between 70 and 90 million that didn't vote at all. So the collective power of people is there for the taking. And I feel that if Democrats just changed the narrative a little bit and stopped with this polarization and just started talking about people rather than eggs necessarily, because not everybody needs eggs. But what we do need is a safe and kind of modern country to live in. Because as it stands, as you said, they want to take it back to the Gilded Age, which Trump calls the Golden Age, at a time when nobody had any rights.
No, and what you just touched on, I just want to share a memory, which was, I was very worried about the 2024 campaign when Harris started talking about support from Goldman Sachs. And, of course, when Liz Cheney started showing up, and when she distanced herself from talking about trans issues and all of those types of things, I got very worried about it, because what has happened with the Democratic Party is they talk so much about the middle class. They talk so much about the economy. Everybody knows that the economy is cooked. Everybody knows it.
Yeah.
And they even cooked the books for a while and how people were supposed to look at it. And I noticed in the lead up, and this was back when Joe Biden was still the nominee, you saw Democratic strategists that were telling people, hey, you don't understand the economy. It's actually great. No, it's not. Yeah. The economy measures how well people are being exploited. It measures how good corporations are doing.
Yeah, how much debt people are managing.
Yes. And so now that we've reached a point where debt is absolutely saturated, where the ability, the old, the pillar foundation of the American dream and the economy has always been home ownership. Now that corporations have made that almost impossible to buy a house, now that we have a generation that is actually doing worse than their parents did before them, education is unaffordable. Healthcare is basically a death sentence in this country. There is an opening to not just continue down this electoral stalemate, because that's what the Democratic Party has done with the Republican Party. They've entered into an agreement, which is the red state, blue state electoral college map. You're just trying to get a couple of states here and there and a few thousand votes here. The people who don't vote in this country, who have given up on the electoral circumstances, those people can be energized.
Yeah.
We've seen them be energized.
Yeah.
You have tens of millions of people, I want to say upwards of 100 million, that do not vote and have completely checked out of politics altogether. If you start to give people something different and a vision, and if you're able to articulate that, and for the record, I think Barack Obama is one of the greatest examples of this. And I always like to remind people, back in 2008, Anthony, he won the state of Indiana, where I'm from. The state of Indiana, and I don't know if people need to be reminded, Barack Obama was a black man in the United States of America. The state of Indiana in the 20th century was under control of a group, the Ku Klux Klan. And why was Barack Obama able to create the coalition that he did? Because he went out and said that NAFTA and free trade had screwed people over and we needed a country for the future. We don't need to talk about what necessarily happened during his presidency. And by the way, frustration over the 2008 financial collapse. You can get people. You can get more voters by giving them an inspiring vision of the future, as opposed to saying we're not going backwards. Right. You can say we're going forward. There's something up there that we can find and it can be better. And people are desperate and thirsty for that.
Change the language. It doesn't have to be the same old script. And then that's what the media does. They take the shooting script from last year and then they just apply it to this year. And so you just have to break the cycle. And I honestly believe that there are some young, energized Democratic leaders, Congress people, who do have that vision and are the right people to step up. They just need to, the old guard maybe need to clear a little space for them.
I think that's being very gentle. I think that's very kind. I do think, and if we had more time, we could get into it. I do think that there is a generational problem that is taking place here.
Of course, yeah.
I think there's also a fear of existential crises that feel outside of our control, including climate change, the changing economy, changing, workspaces, all of that. There is a tendency for people to get overwhelmed by those things and become conservative.
Yes.
And one of the problems with the Democratic Party is that they sort of convince themselves that nothing can change, right? That we're basically in, again, this immutable spot where you can't actually create something different. You have to only protect what you have. And it has a long history of doing this. And there are spurts and starts where they're able to picture something else. Usually it happens around a crisis. I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, again, the stories are that he got in office and he carried these things out. No, there were movements that created the space for an FDR to become FDR and the New Deal to take place. We have to create those spaces. We have to demand something different in order to overcome that hesitancy and that fear.
And take some lessons from Europe, because Europe is seeing huge growth in the green industries. Most of their growth is coming by adopting the green energy and putting people to work in those industries. And it's such a dirty word in this country. Yep. Trump calls it the Green New Scam. And so Democrats have shied away from even talking about climate change. But actually, that is the solution to a lot of this stuff, is taking our lead from Europe rather than America pre-Trump.
Yeah, recently I joined a nonprofit called the Change Campaign, and I started looking at the numbers and sort of looking at the possible solutions. And Anthony, wouldn't you believe that it turns out that everything that is wrong right now has an answer and would actually be beneficial for everybody. And on top of that, if you want to be a capitalist, it would actually create incredible wealth and opportunities and innovation. So my entire point of saying that is this: we have gotten so conservative trying to protect what we have, which for the record is leading us to the existential crisis of climate change, authoritarianism, you name it, collapse. We have gotten so used to protecting that we have allowed the actual solutions to the material conditions that got us to this place to be completely moved off the board. And to go back to what you were saying, I think it's important to point out, what does this moment ask of us? It asks for courage. And that's what's lacking right now. It's the courage to present a different solution that might be scary. And guess what? We're going to make mistakes sometimes, and it's not going to work out sometimes. We're going to have to move and shift and do all these types of things. You take a look at every major political movement that's ever done it. They make mistakes. There are missteps. The New Deal, which completely saved the country from fascist takeover and economic collapse, they made mistakes. And we should learn from that. But the political courage is needed to summon up an alternative that some people aren't going to like. And if any Democratic operative, pundit, or politician is listening, you have to get over your fear that you're going to be called a radical, that you're going to be called a socialist or a communist. The most pro-capitalist, the most moderate and conservative Democrats are called socialist and communist. And you have to get over this fear of being portrayed like that and just stand up for your principles and do what's right, and the rest will fill in itself.
I'm grateful for this conversation because there's too much doom, and I feel that we might have touched on something that will give people some hope. So I'm grateful to you, Jared Yates Sexton. Thanks for joining The Weekend.
My friend, always a pleasure.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. You can join the 5 Minute News YouTube channel, and I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.